Hi, I'm Wesley Crone. I'm a professor of political science at Widener and also the chair of the political science department. Welcome to this module that's going to explore how governments around the world have reacted to COVID-19 and their responses and how effective they've been. I'm going to have three sessions here that discuss what's going on in the United States, and I'm going to focus in on one specific area, and that is the area of federalism and why that makes response to COVID-19 somewhat difficult. So this session is entitled Why American Government Structure Caused Confusion in COVID-19 Responses. Now, when I mention the word federalism in normal times, nobody has any interest in this whatsoever. But what we've seen is a really great expansion in people's interest in this concept of federalism as they try to understand who's responsible for the response to COVID-19. So for this first session, I'd like to give us a little bit of a primer about federalism and what it means, and give us some background for the setup of studying exactly what's happening in the United States. So by way of background here, I would have to say, as I dig deeply in my mind and thought about what we're going to talk about in this session, that I looked through the years of education that I had and tried to come up with a really profound word that would describe what we're seeing right now with COVID-19 in the United States. And I don't think it came from a textbook, but I think the word would be messy. Messy sounds pretty good. This has been absolutely a mess, because what we have is a series of overlapping responsibilities for different levels of government here in the United States. And one of the things that politicians are generally want to do is that they are very willing to place the blame on other people when things don't go right, and we've certainly seen that happening here in the US. So just to give you a couple of examples, I'm going to pull out Governor Andrew Cuomo here, who's probably been one of the most vocal governors, primarily because of the amount of cases of COVID in New York State and also in New York City, and use New York as an example of the ways that politicians at different levels of government have dealt with each other. So back at the early part, before the stay-at-home mandates were issued, on March 9th, Governor Cuomo said, I'm battling the mixed messages from the federal government that President Trump and Vice President Pence basically give mixed messages that add to the fear and frustration of people. So he's placing the blame really at the feet of President Trump, and President Trump comes back and says, there are no mixed messages, only political weaponization by people like you. Meaning, in other words, take responsibility for your state. I'm not responsible for that in the federal system. So we have this immediate battle going back and forth between a governor and the president. And this continues to go on. So, about a week or so later, President Trump says, just had a very good teleconference with the nation's governors, went very well. Cuomo of New York has to, quote unquote, do more. To which Governor Cuomo responds, I have to do more? No, you have to do something. You're supposed to be the president. And we've seen these battles back and forth between particularly Democratic governors and the Republican president. Oftentimes, some of the Republican states, at least early on, weren't hit quite as hard, and Republican governors were much less willing to criticize President Trump. Some Republican governors, such as Larry Hogan, who's governor of Maryland, which is a deep blue Democratic state, were willing to stand up and take on the Trump administration. But for the most part, we saw a lot of jockeying around for position here between them. But that's not the only conflicts that take place. What also took place, as we see as we look around the country, was also strife between governors and their mayors. So again, let's stick with New York State. And what we see here is Governor Cuomo on the left here, and then New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. Now, they've had a contentious relationship for years, so this is nothing new. But some of the themes that came out here are themes that we see around the country, and that is that there were questions of who has authority to do what. So earlier on, we had Mayor de Blasio basically making the argument that he was going to shut down the city of New York and issue a stay-at-home order, to which Governor Cuomo said, you don't have that power. I'm the governor. I can do that. Later on, Mayor de Blasio said, we're going to shut the schools down for the rest of the year. Governor Cuomo said, you don't have the right to do that. I'm the governor. In Pennsylvania, where Widener's located, some of the district attorneys, particularly from Republican areas of the state, basically said that they were not going to enforce Governor Wolf, who is a Democrat, they were not going to enforce his stay-at-home orders. So we have all this infighting and this messy situation all surrounding us when it comes to this concept of federalism. Now, I say federalism is messy, and it's really by design. So the world's foremost authority, although he's passed away, world's foremost authority on federalism was Daniel Elazar. And I think he gives us this really good quote that can help us think through what we're seeing happening right now. The political principles that animate federal systems emphasize the primacy of bargaining and negotiated cooperation. Among several different power centers, they stress the virtues of dispersed power centers as a means for safeguarding individual and local liberties. Now note that I was the one that highlighted and italicized that primacy of bargaining and negotiating cooperation. There's in the United States kind of two schools of thought right now that are going on. One is that we need to centralize all decisions in the national government. And then on the other hand, that it's really up to the governors to take care of their states. But that's not the way the system really works. It's a system of cooperation. And that's the way the federal system works. And different governments negotiate with each other, work in cooperation with each other, may have a little strife between each other, fight amongst themselves a little bit, but the goal is to produce a good outcome as as a result of this conversation that's taking place. Now, step back for a second on this idea of federalism. Federalism is one of the key components of American government, but we oftentimes forget about it. It's kind of a forgotten stepchild. And if we take a look at the cardinal rules or the cardinal characteristics of our constitutional designs, it's one of the 5 most important principles we have. The founders were very worried about having any one group in society have too much power over the other. So they created a system in government that was designed to be messy, that was designed to work slowly. But that's kind of the negative side of it. The positive side is they also wanted to ensure that everybody's voice was heard. So while we have all these different systems of checks and balances and different public officials, the goal also is to make sure that people's voices are heard in this democracy. And the beauty for federalism then is it creates both unity. We have a national government that represents everybody. And then we have state and local governments, which represent smaller constituencies where people can decide on their own what they want to do given their own cultures. So of the 5 characteristics of which federalism is one of, representative democracy is the first. In other words, we elect our officials to make decisions on our behalf. We have what we can call the extended republic, which is this notion that we have a huge country made up of many different interests so that one interest can't dominate all the others. We're constantly building coalitions. We've got federalism. We've got separation of powers. So at the federal level, as well as at the state level, we have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And each one of these branches has checks and balances over the other to keep any one branch from having all the power. So all this is, federalism is part and parcel of this whole idea of compromise and working together and cooperation that we see enshrined in our US Constitution. One last thing before we step forward here. There's a little model here on the right-hand side of how citizens relate to their governments. And in a federal system, it's almost like having dual citizenship. So I'm both a citizen of the state of Pennsylvania and a citizen of the United States of America. I have the rights under the Pennsylvania Constitution, the rights under the laws that are drafted by Pennsylvania, and also have the rights under the US Constitution and also the federal government's laws as well. And one thing that I think we really need to think about, although this is messy, that little arrow that goes back and forth there at the bottom between the federal government and the state government means cooperation. They work together. They pass around information. Federal government gives money to the states, and they work together. That's part of the American federal system. Now, one last thing before we move on to the next session, which really focuses specifically on what's happening with COVID right now, is that we can take a look at 2 models of federalism as given to us by a scholar named Morton Grodstens. He says, on the left-hand side here, we see a layer cake federalism. And each layer is specifically defined and contained in one area. So there's the federal government at the top, state government in the middle, local government at the bottom. They all have the stuff that they do, and they never interact with each other. Right? Education, state and local issue, federal government doesn't get involved. Military, federal issue, state and locals don't get involved. Well, what Grodson says is, and this is what's most appropriate to getting us ready to really study what's going on with COVID-19 is, Grodson said that's not really the way things work in a federal system. What we really have is a system that works and looks really, to use a metaphor, like a marble cake, right? So, the federal government, again, is kind of on the top. It's the chocolate and mostly on the top, and then the state governments are on the bottom. They're the vanilla and they're mostly on the bottom. But in a marble cake, they swirl around, and sometimes the vanilla and the chocolate interact with each other. And that's really what the federal system is all about. It's about power sharing. It's about compromise. It's about people working together across these governments rather than having strict divisions of power. So that's the introduction I'm going to give you on federalism as we move into the COVID-19 discussion. I'd ask that you do the readings for this session, which are focused in on who has the power to do what in the federal system related to COVID-19. And as you think through that, think about how effective is this model? How does it represent this marble cake federalism model? And do you think that this is a really appropriate system that we should have in the United States? And the teaser for the next session is, and when we come back, we'll take a look at specifically who has been doing what and at what different levels of government here in the United States during the COVID-19 crisis.